Attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's webinar on the nuts and bolts of wool with our presenter, Lisa Serber of LM Livestock Services. My name is Jay Parsons, and I will be your host and moderator this evening. And I'd like to start by thanking the Let's Grow Committee and the American Sheep Industry Association for making these webinars possible. Without their funding support, we couldn't provide these for producers, and we really appreciate them supporting these webinars and making this information available to our producers. I'd like to encourage you to visit the ASI website at www.sheepusa.org. There you can access a whole bunch of materials to help you be successful in the sheep business, and along with seeing all the different services and resources that ASI provides to producers. You'll also find a link there to the Let's Grow website, where you'll see past recordings of webinars, and you'll also see this webinar recording provided here in the next 48 hours. With that, I'd like to remind listeners that we are recording this webinar, and if you registered for it, which I assume you did, if you're on, you will receive a follow-up email within the next 48 hours with a direct link to that recording, as well as a link to access the webinar slides. We're slated for about a 45-minute presentation here, followed by 20 to 25 minutes of questions. I'd like to encourage our listeners to submit questions throughout the presentation or during the Q&A session by using the question box in the lower right-hand side of your control panel. You can type those in at any time, and I'll be monitoring them throughout the webinar, but we'll wait and handle all of those questions at the end during the Q&A session. If you have a microphone connected to your computer, you can also interact directly with our speaker during that Q&A session by raising your hand, and I'll go through that process when we reach that point and before we actually start the Q&A session. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce this evening's speaker, Dr. Lisa Serber. Dr. Serber has a long history working with the sheep and wool industry. Most notably, she was the manager of the Montana State University Wool Lab for 12 years and working with the extension sheep specialist up there, Dr. Rodney Cott. That's where I first came in contact with Lisa, and goes way back, but Lisa and Dr. Cott and Reed Redden, who was at North Dakota State, were the very first presenters on these ASI webinars. So that seems like a long time ago, Lisa, but we finally got you back on here to present and talk about something that I know you're really passionate about, and that is wool. By way of reference, Lisa is now in South Dakota. She's the executive secretary of South Dakota Sheep Growers, and so she's coming to us from South Dakota this evening, and we really appreciate her taking the time to share this knowledge with sheep producers throughout the country. So with that, Lisa, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you because I know you have a lot of material to cover, and I'll be back to handle the Q&A session when you're ready for that part.
Oh, great. Thanks, Jay. I can't tell everybody how thrilled I am this evening to be able to visit with you about something that I am very, very passionate about. I enjoy talking about. It's something that I've tried to make a career out of, is really to dealing with wool. My consulting business takes me a lot of different places, and I get to work with a lot of different wool growers, doing workshops across Canada and the U.S. And so, you know, I'm just thrilled, and I'm also very grateful to Jay and to the Let's Grow Committee for asking me to be a part of this evening. So I kind of like to start things, and those of you that have been my former students know that I asked you this question, and I kind of wanted to start the presentation tonight asking you on how you're spreading your love for sheep, lamb, and wool. And I want you to think about that over the next 45 minutes, because I may ask you again, or I hope to ask you again, and Jay didn't mention it, but there is a survey question that I will want you guys to answer that helps me kind of see really what the diversity of this audience is. But I think it's really important, and many of you have heard me say and ask you what's your elevator conversation, what's your elevator opener when you're talking to people about wool. And so again, I kind of want you to think about that. But when I think about the things that I talk to people about is, and these are really great images. I stole these images from the Campaign for Wool, and probably a number of you have seen them in social media. And they're simple, but they drive home the point of some of the really, really great benefits of wool. And the fact that it's natural, it's renewable, it's biodegradable, it's sustainable. Things that we need to be able to talk to, you know, people in the grocery store, people in your, you know, in your Uber ride, wherever the case is. Finding little things to talk to people about to show the diversity of wool, because I don't think we need to tell people that wool is as insulating. We know that a lot of people know the kind of the traditional ways of thinking about wool, but do they think about wool being naturally odor repellent? Do they think about wool being naturally flame resistant, breathable, wicking sweat away from your body, things like that? And so we need to be able to have that elevator conversation with people, you know, and really try and introduce them to the new aspects of wool. And, you know, one of the ways that I do it is, and it sounds kind of funny, is I talk to them about socks, because I guess unless you're in Florida, pretty much everybody wears socks. And so that's an easy opener to talk about wool. I'm going to kind of give you a little bit of an outline of where I'm headed tonight. I thought that might be helpful. I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about a very traditional topic, and that's contamination of wool, and some of the ways that wool can be contaminated. And so we'll spend just a few minutes talking about that. We'll spend a few minutes talking about factors that influence the price of wool. And I want you to, you know, my former students know that I talk a lot about the commercial industry, but I really made a concerted effort tonight to really also focus in on more of the specialty marketing and niche marketing and things that influence that side of our industry. We'll talk a little bit about wool marketing, in particular specialty wool marketing and adding value to your wool. And I'll spend just a few minutes at the end talking about some of the trends or interesting new things that are going on with wool, not necessarily in the States or in North America, but kind of worldwide. And so I think I'm going to take you on a fun journey tonight, and I really hope you enjoy the places that we go. So the first thing I want to spend a little bit of time talking to you about is contamination. And I kind of have some clues down at the bottom in those pictures of things that are really kind of big things that impact when we price wool. So anything that's not wool is considered a contaminant. And a fleece is either, fleece contamination is either something that animal acquires naturally, so it's produced by the sheep. It can be acquired, meaning that it's stuff that it picked up in its fleece during the course of the production year, vegetable matter, and other animal fibers. And we'll talk a lot about polypropylene or poly. And then things that are applied to the sheep in some way, shape, or form, whether it's paint brands, a lot of range or large production operations, and even some small, utilize paint brands to help identify sheep. And then, of course, we use some medications or treatments to, you know, tackle some of our external parasite issues. And sometimes those can be a contamination issue as well. So the point in all of this is that we really should care and make an effort to do something about contamination, because ultimately it not only affects you as a grower in trying to market your wool, but it affects how that wool is processed and is able to be processed further down the production chain. And so if there's a tremendous amount of burrs or vegetable matter or polypropylene or staining, that really all costs the processing side of the industry money. And so the more that we can do to eliminate or reduce as best we can those contaminants, the better off we are. I want to talk, of course, about a very kind of traditional, beef that I guess we have in the industry, and sometimes that's just the way that we have to deal with our forage production, is the use of polypropylene for twine. And I've got 4 examples on this slide. And of course, twine or something that we'd use to put up our hay bales, that's a really traditional method. We see a lot of that. And of course, it's pretty hard not to utilize that to tie up gates or panels. But if we can make a conscious effort to pick up twine and throw it in the garbage when we can, you'd be surprised how helpful that is. Everybody uses those blue poly tarps. It's an inexpensive means to cover things up. But the problem with them, as you know, is when they whip in the wind, they fray. And those little blue fragments do get picked up or spread very easily. One of the more recent uses, and I say this in a laughing kind of manner, but I've seen a lot of wool delivered in these grain totes. And the problem with that is, again, that the materials that they're made out of, they will fray if they're damaged, and then that white poly then becomes a part of that white wool, and it's very difficult to see and to get rid of. And of course, the most recent and newest form of poly is net wrapping. Very commonly used way of storing or baling up hay, round bales. And you'd be surprised, again, how those net wrap fragments can be picked up in sheep's wool very, very easily. So along with acquired contamination like poly, you can have applied contamination such as paint brands, and you can see that these sheep are having paint brands applied to them. It might be, again, prior to lambing, it might be after lambing. It's pretty commonly used. And there are some, and I'm sure you've heard this numerous times, there are some processors that don't want any paint at all. And they pay a premium for not having paint in their wool. As long as we're using scourable paint, and we're not manipulating that paint in any way, shape, or form. And what I mean by manipulating it, I mean changing the chemical composition by thinning it with products like diesel fuel, or heating it over a fire to try and thin it. Both of those things change the chemical composition of that paint from scourable to non-scourable. In addition, a lot of times we commonly use, and particularly on mixed operations, cattle and sheep, you'll have these handy dandy grease markers around, and those grease markers tend not to scour out as well. So if you are going to use those, make sure you apply those to something like a nose rather than on fleece wool down their back. I've got a good example of, and I'm trusting that you'll be able to see this, but this is a large operation that's using, of course, a KED treatment and they're just squirting a little line down their back. Sometimes that an oil-based product can cause some staining if applied much later than shearing time, and so that can cause a little bit of staining or contamination as well. All right, so I kind of want to, now that I've kind of, got on my soapbox about contamination, I want to kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about factors that influence wool price. And of course, you've got your foundation, and I was trying to find an illustration that did a better job of this, but think about the genetics or the breed that you're using or breeding as the foundation for what you're doing. And so, although you can renovate your house in some way, shape, or form, you can't necessarily change the foundation unless you change houses. And so I think of the breed or the genetics of your sheep in that regard. And so that's kind of the foundation. Again, that starts you off on where where you can go. Then you've got some influence from the environment and the management of those sheep during the production year. If feed resources were tight or if feed resources were really good, that can have an influence on your fleece quality. And with fleece quality, then you can have a number of factors that can impact that. And they can be influenced by, and we already talked about the kind and the level of contamination. That has an influence on price. And what I mean by shearing skill is if you, for instance, have a rookie shearer that you're trying to give a chance to learn to be better, and he has a little bit of trouble, or he or she has a little bit of trouble with second cuts, that can impact fleece quality. And particularly if you're trying to have a super high quality fleece for the specialty market arena, the skill level of your shearer can have a great deal of impact. And then, of course, if you're skirting, if you're classing or sorting, and then the packaging that you're putting those fleeces into. And if you're putting fleeces into a dirty, contaminated bag to begin with, that's obviously having an impact as well. And then lastly, all of those factors can affect your overall clip quality, and then the direction in which you're going to go. And I'm not saying you have to choose one or the other. You may choose a mixture and taking some of your premium fleeces and marketing them in a specialty or niche manner. But again, all of those factors ultimately affect how you're going to be able to market, and then ultimately the price that you're going to receive. And so I kind of want to split this up now and talk about some more specific factors that influence. And I'm going to divide our conversation up into commercial marketing and then specialty or niche marketing, and look at some of the factors that are important to both of those methods or ways to market wool. And of course, when we're marketing wool on a commercial basis, we focus in on a lot of things that are what we would consider objective measurements, things that we can test for in a laboratory setting. Micron, yield, VM stands for vegetable matter. We can also test for length and strength. And we may be interested in other factors, the uniformity of the clip or the uniformity of the wool that's put up into bales. The style, is it really bright and white and stylish wool? The preparation, is that wool skirted or is it run across a table? Is it board skirted or is it just strictly bellies out? Also, something that may impact is breed, and then of course other forms of contamination that we may be concerned about. When you switch to the other side of the spectrum, specialty marketing, and you'll see that I have some factors here, and I have subjective factors question mark. And the reason why I put that there is because some of these may be, you may have registration papers that document that you have a certain breed of sheep. You have a ruler out with the locks that you've got pictured in your advertising. That's not subjective, that's objective. But some of these other factors, you really have no way of of having a scientific means to measure those. And particularly and especially marking that connection to the ranch or the grower or even the sheep named Sally, you know, all have an impact on how that wool is marketed. And some of these other factors may be secondary. And in fact, I'll use this as an example. I saw a lovely fleece being marketed on Facebook within the last few days. And I mean, the pictures were really quite remarkable. And just out of curiosity, I asked and I sent this person a message and I said, can you tell me what the micron is of this fleece? And you know, she didn't have a micron for it, and I was just doing it out of curiosity, not to certainly diminish the fleece in any way, because it really was quite lovely. But it's not as an important a factor to some of the people that would be interested in her fleece. And then of course color, you know, bright and white can have luster can have an impact. More tactile measurements, I guess, so to speak, like handle, then uniformity and crimp style may also be a factor. So there's a lot of commonalities, but there are a lot of differences between the two and how we would be able to market. I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the value determining factors. And of course, you know, when we talk about grade, we're referring to micron, which is a millionth or 1/1,000,000th of a meter. Staple length, that's always very important, because each grade should have a minimum staple length. And so the coarser the wool, the longer the staple should be. And sometimes that isn't necessarily always the case. Yield. Yield is important because most trading on a commercial basis is based on yield. And so, you know, even when I'm looking at a fleece to, you know, judge it or grade it, I'm estimating what the yield is of that fleece. And most people are able to kind of get, you know, pretty close. But again, normally we'd want to have that based on scientific or objective measurement. And then of course, again, vegetable matter matters. It really, really does. Again, because it limits on where we can go in terms of processing those fleeces. So less than 3% is desirable, but really less than 1% is ideal. And when you get into specialty marketing of fleeces, you want to be able to see virtually no vegetable matter, because again, the more vegetable matter, the more picking that has to occur, and picking costs time and money. One of the things that I also want to talk to you a little bit about is of some of the methodologies that we can utilize to determine some of these quality factors. And I think one of the fastest and most cost-effective means of determining, for instance, micron is the use of the ODFA technology. And certainly, and I see I've got a typo, it should be OFDA technology and not the way I have it. But I think that we have an ability here in the US to utilize some of these machines that have been placed in some key areas. And some of the measurements that it can give you is fiber diameter and the associated measurements of variation, such as standard deviation and coefficient of variation. It can measure comfort factor and spinning fineness, which can be of interest, particularly to the specialty markets. And then curvature. Curvature may be of interest to people as well, and that has a relationship to crimp. Just as an example, I've got up in the top picture, I've got 2 wool samples there that were measured using the ODFA technology. They're virtually very similar in terms of micron, which is the top number, and fairly similar in terms of CF or comfort factor, but look where they differ greatly. And again, that that curvature is related to crimp, and you can see that visually very easily with that sample. And again, it's certainly of interest. There are university labs here in the U.S. that, and as Jay mentioned, I worked at one of them at Montana State. There's also a machine at North Dakota State University, at Utah State University, and of course at Texas A&M in San Angelo at the wool lab there. And so again, there's opportunities for you to get wool samples tested very reasonably. And of course, we have a very notable commercial laboratory in the United States, and that's Yoakum McCall in Denver, Colorado. They do all types of fiber testing there, and they, again, do it very quickly and very reasonably as well. I do some on-site wool testing services with my OFTA that I use for selection and classing purposes, and so I have some availability of that as well. I wanted to kind of remind you too that these quality factors do matter. No matter what route that you choose to market your wool, whether you're going the commercial direction or whether you're going the specialty direction, all of the processes, I mean, think about all the things that wool has to go through, from growing the wool fiber on the sheep all the way to, for instance, a finished fabric. Think about all of the processes those fibers have to endure. And so they have to be uniform, and they have to be strong, and they have to be long in order to endure, you know, carding and combing, if that's the process that wool is going to undergo. And so these quality factors, although some of them may be measured subjectively, they still matter to whoever, whether you're talking about a hand spinner or a mini mill or a large commercial processing facility like Chargiers. Those quality factors do matter. And if they aren't consistent, you run into things that cost the industry money. And so I kind of wanted to now talk a little bit about, and I'm going to generalize here quite a bit because I think we could spend a whole nother webinar talking about how wool is priced. And so really that's not the focus of tonight's presentation, but I think it's worth having a little bit of discussion. And so many producers, and in that very top picture, that happens to be at a wool pool delivery that I was at. And so a lot of those producers sold, you know, 5 or 6 garbage bags full of wool. And so they have no means, unless they, you know, took it upon themselves beforehand, they have no means of getting information on micron, yield, vegetable matter. And so that wool is often priced based on a grease price. So the weight that they weighed in at on delivery day, and they get shot a price, and that's what they have to work with. Whereas larger growers, and for instance, that semi-truckload of wool on the bottom, often sell based on a core test. And you can see there's a picture of Dr. Pope from Texas there doing a core of a bale. And so he's got an instrument essentially just like a core tube if you're testing hay. He's doing the same thing. And he's getting a representative sample of that whole clip or that whole lot of wool that's going to be sold. And so that helps then to get yield and vegetable matter, and then of course micron. And so then they can price that wool based on the yield of that sample or that clip of wool. And so in this example, we've got an established clean price of $5. And I made this very simple for math purposes. And the yield was 50%. And they had some handling or overhead charges depending on where they were marketing to. And so I'll describe what that 25 cents it comes into it. And so basically, you know, in this instance, this wool was priced at $2.25 per pound. And so those handling costs might include things like freight. It might include warehouse or pool charges. It might include grading charges at a central warehouse. It might include commission, or it might include coring or some type of testing charges. And so that's what's all encompassing into that, what we would call handling or overhead costs. So hopefully you kind of have an idea. And again, this was a very simplistic example, but I think it was worth reviewing. And so I'm going to kind of give you an overview here, and then we're going to dive a little bit deeper into some of these. And so you as a wool producer, you've got a lot of different options, and I've kind of outlined them here. You can market to a field buyer if you have that availability. Out here in the West, there's more options in that regard. You know, there's pools all across the U.S., and I know some are larger and stronger than others, but there's still availability of wool pools, and we'll talk a little bit more about what a wool pool is in just a minute. And then, of course, you've got your local warehouse that oftentimes will purchase wool and work with you on marketing your wool. And now I think that there's an even more prevalent specialty market. And the reason why I wanted to spend some time talking about this particular avenue is because of the growth of this area. And I think it's foolish for us to deny that this segment of the industry is significant. And I like to draw this analogy in that, you know, 10, 15 years ago, even more like 20 years ago, we didn't pay as close attention to what we called the non-traditional market in the lamb industry. And now we are recognizing that that plays a significant role in how many, many lambs are marketed in the U.S. And so I want to kind of draw that analogy with this specialty or niche marketing, because and I'll explain to you why this is significant in just a minute. But these folks are helping to create demand for wool. And again, I think it's foolish on our parts to ignore this avenue of marketing. So from here, we can go, wool can then go to what we call a central market or an exporter or another dealer, another person or company that would be involved in exporting wool. Remember, we are, the United States and North America, for that matter, are very export market driven. I believe last year in the neighborhood of 70% or greater of our wool gets marketed somewhere other than the United States. And in Canada, for those of you listening from Canada, that number is more like 90%. And so we're very, very export market driven. From there, that wool may be processed in a U.S. mill, such as Chargier's in South Carolina, or it may be exported and processed in a foreign mill. If we then kind of look at the specialty market, there's a number of avenues that it can take, from internet sales to fiber festivals to small private mills that are buying and trading wool. And so there's a lot of, I think, opportunities here, but with each of these opportunities, you have to be, I would say, knowledgeable and skilled on what the market needs or what you're going to, how you're going to enter it, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So I want to just take a couple minutes and talk about pools, because I worked a lot with the pool system in Montana, so I'm familiar with that, and excited to kind of tell you a little bit about that, because it's still a very active means of which people market wool. And so they have a central collection site and location. Oftentimes there's a person on site that is doing some kind of inspection of that wool. You know, maybe extension personnel that is in charge of weighing. And they then have the ability to consolidate those fleeces or those bales of wool into larger lots that can make that wool much more marketable. Meaning that they're trying to put wool into marketable lots of wool to ease the cost of transportation. I mean, as many of you are aware, overland transportation is hugely expensive, and is more expensive, if you can believe it, than putting wool on a boat and shipping it overseas. And so the things that a pool has to have, though, is there has to be you know, a collective group of people that are willing to help out, and they also have to have some expertise in handling that wool. Is there, you know, somebody who is skilled enough to grade the wool? And that's a challenge in some places. And then, can you build a volume of wool that makes it appealing for a buyer to spend the money to, number one, buy the wool, but then transport that wool from that location to a central warehouse location? All right, so as I mentioned, you can also market wool, and I have a few friends and clients that market their wool in this manner. And so they're offering their wool to a buyer or a broker or a mill based on their reputation, but also they're basing it on a scientific core test that is certified from Yoka McCall. And so then they do it what we call, they can do it on a sealed bid basis, or, you know, I'm going to take phone bids from 6 to 7 o'clock tonight, and I'll expect your bid during that time frame. And so they'll advertise, they'll tell the buyers, hey, I'm going to accept bids on this day from this time. And then basically it's up to the grower to determine who has the best bid, who has the best or highest bid, and then arrange the pickup or delivery. And so it's up to the grower. If he wants to take that bid, he can. If it's not good enough, he can sit on the wool. I mean, the most he would have is some warehouse charges if he's at a central warehouse, or he may have a really good place to store it at home, and he may want to wait out the market. And there are people that will do that as well. Certainly with wool auctions, and I'm getting there. Hopefully you can see this slide. And this picture comes from Utah Wool Marketing. And in fact, they just had a really big wool sale last week that they sold 1 million pounds of wool in 160 different lots. And so it was a huge sale. And so typically this warehouse or a number of warehouses like Roswell Wool, for instance, or Utah Wool Marketing, wools are sent there after shearing, and then they're core tested, and then grab samples are taken, and you can see that's what these two gentlemen are doing, is they're looking at grab samples from those lots of wool, because they don't want to just look at data. They want to be able to feel and look at that wool. They want to look at how strong it is, how bright and white it is, how stylish it is. Things like that also matter to them. And so they can have that sale held in person or some type of electronic bidding process. Huge sales in Australia are held like this as well. And each buyer has their data and actual grab samples, and they can base their bids on looking at that wool. I want to kind of keep moving along here and talk a little bit about some of the Midwestern wool warehouses. Again, the purpose behind sorting wool in this manner, and that you can see that's what this gentleman is doing, is he's looking at wool fleece by fleece, is he's trying to put together marketable loads of wool. And ultimately that's the goal is to help growers realize more money by the warehouse separating and sorting wools, differing in grade or quality or vegetable matter or type or kind. And so that's a way that Midwestern wool warehouses operate. Okay, I'm gonna now kind of get into more of the specialty or niche marketing avenue. And so those of you production range larger growers, stick with me here. Don't disappear, because I think that this is a really important topic that all of the wool industry needs to be thinking about. And so I put a couple of pictures up here, and these pictures happen to be from the Maryland Sheep and Wool Festival. And if I have my dates correct, this is coming up this weekend. And this is a huge event, and the scope of it, and although I've never been there, I've had many friends that have been there or participate in it, have booths in it. This is an event that attracts 100,000 people plus going through the gates, and they're not just window shopping, they're buying, and they have buying power. And so specialty or niche marketing is marketing local wool products locally, regionally, or nationally. You can be marketing direct to mini mills, for instance, selling fleece, or making some type of product and then selling that product. Again, sheep and wool festivals are getting hugely popular and growing all the time. And I'll give you some numbers here in just a minute that support why that's happening. Farmers markets are big, and again, all of these avenues, this idea of local food and local wool, or knowing where your clothes come from, is gaining leaps and bounds. So when we think about who are we marketing to with specialty markets, we're marketing to fiber artists or fiber enthusiasts, hand spinners, weavers, some folks like indie yarn dyers and companies. There are a number of what I would consider large companies like Brooklyn Tweed that would fall under this category. What kind of market is there out there? And I think these numbers to me are staggering. And so I want you to, I kind of got it divided into two groups. So you've got what we would consider the needle art enthusiasts. And this information comes from the National Needle Arts Association. And I had this explained to me in that these folks are serious about trying to get their hands around who these people are and how many there are out there. And so they do committed surveys, if not every year, every other year, to compile this data. And so when you look at needle art enthusiasts, you've got approximately 1 million adults spending upwards of 750 to 850 million dollars a year. And so that means that each one of those folks, an average of about $819 a year, they're spending on these type of products. And they are shopping at very specific types of businesses. They're looking for a story, they're looking for local, they're looking for something special about that retailer or that story that product is telling. Then you've got what we would consider needle art participants. This is a much more general group of folks, but look at the volume. 30 to 40 million adults are participating in some type of needle art activity. They're spending $2 to $3 billion on this type of hobby or activity or business potentially. These folks are spending about $60 a year, in terms of product, but they're more likely to shop at what I would consider the kind of the chain retailers. That's why places like Walmart sells yarn. Some of the more chain retailers. So what is important to the folks that are spending, about $820 a year annually? Well, here's kind of a rundown. Of course, like everybody else, they're looking for made in the USA. That's important to them. They're looking at products that are handmade. They're looking for products that are local. Again, that local wool, local clothes, local food. They're looking for fair trade. They're looking for socially conscious. And I think that term is kind of interesting. And I think wool fits well with these type of people. We are, again, remember our elevator story. We're biodegradable. We're sustainable. We're ethical. And they're also looking, a few of these folks are looking for organic. And so I think this data really speaks volumes, and I think it's interesting. And again, I'll stand on my soapbox. I think it's foolish to think that we can ignore this type of volume of people that are interested in wool and that are helping to drive the demand for our products. And I don't think it matters whether you're a commercial producer or whether you're a niche or specialty market producer. These folks have buying power. All right, so if we're trying to add value, and I'm gonna try and speed up through this section because I'm getting kind of windy here. When you add value, when you're trying to add value, when you're direct marketing wool, you have some options. But every option that you have can add value, but it can also add time and money. And so what's the sequence of this added value process for wool? Because I tell you, it's not just as simple as shearing and then trying to sell that wool online. There's many additional steps that require a relationship with a processor or a mill if you're going to be successful. So let's quickly talk about raw fleece sales. This is one of the most common ways that people market wool. It strongly appeals to consumers that are hand spinners and hand or weavers. It also appeals to the folks that like the idea of your ranch story, your sheep story, that this is Sally's fleece, and they come back and they buy Sally's fleece every single year. This can be a very profitable avenue of marketing as well. Again, I mentioned this already, that they like knowing your farm, your sheep. They like knowing the story. You may take additional steps and in terms of washing or scouring the wool and selling specific parts or locks. This is very popular for the arts and crafts side of things. You know, some wool or locks resembles doll hair, and people will pay an extraordinary amount of money for those. Some advantages and disadvantages, of course, you've got increased wool prep. You may have to cover or blanket sheep. You may not be able to sell the whole fleece. You may have to sell sections of it. Again, shipping of that is a challenge. And then I want to mention that you have to have a breed also that is coveted by these people. You know, and it's sometimes difficult to figure that out. Then as you move again forward in the amount of input that you put into it, roving sales have some interest. That's wool that's been washed and carded and presented in such a manner. These happen to be dyed. It's a versatile product. People like it for felting, but they also like it for going on and hand spinning themselves and many more avenues. Batting is getting to be an interesting avenue, and particularly, and I'll mention this, I'll get to the bottom of this slide, because you take batting a step further and you are into the finished bedding. There's a huge popularity right now with wool bedding. And there's a lot of science, and there's a really interesting IWTO article about the science of wool and sleep. And so you can just Google that and find out information on that. And so bedding, wool bedding is hugely popular right now. Of course, felt sales. as Jay mentioned, I am involved with the South Dakota sheep growers. And I happened to put up a post in reference to wool dryer balls. And I was amazed how many times that got shared, 120 times on Facebook, and reached 26,000 people. And it was all just, you know, interesting information about how wool dryer balls work, and then some tutorials on making your own. And again, tremendous interest in that. And again, if that's their entry point into wool, that's great. Then if you get into yarn sales, and this is going to cost you money in I would say in two ways. It's going to cost you either time or money. Having fiber spun into yarn at a mill can be very expensive, and the mill has minimum requirements. I had some figures, but they're not at my fingertips. But you know, this can be, again, building a relationship with a mill is very, very important. Keep in mind, the turnaround on this is not going to be next week. This is going to be something that you're going to have to plan for and expect not to see that finished product for 6 months to a year, and maybe even longer. If you're going to attempt to spin it yourself, you have to have, there's a learning curve, obviously. There's some interest in being able to just produce yarn that's natural. Some customers like to dye their own. You can increase some value if you're interested in growing your own dyes and dyeing your own wool. And what a unique and interesting, again, story to tell to be able to market your wool. Certainly hand knit sales are another avenue. Another way to tell your ranch. I have some friends that are having blankets made right now, and that again is going to tell their ranch story, and create a lovely, lasting product that they'll be able to market. One of the most common challenges here is keeping up with the demand. Maybe it's going to be a one-of-a-kind product, but can you make enough products? Are you going to have to solicit the help of other people to keep your value-added process going? And what types of products that you can produce will depend on your interest, but it's also going to depend on the breed of sheep that you raise. You aren't going to be able to make next to skin baby clothes with a more challenging, bolder, coarser fiber. Some other thoughts that I also wanted to mention is, and I think I want to drive this home, is that in any avenue that we're discussing, whether it's commercial or niche marketing, quality is a key, no matter what form that they take. And so you have to be able to produce a very high quality product to have a person come back time and time again. And high quality products come from healthy, well cared for sheep. And again, that adds to the appeal to these socially conscious consumers. And again, you saw the numbers. Those people are interested in using wool. And I have a picture here of a blanketed or jacketed sheep. It may require some increased husbandry and increased costs of looking after those sheep, but in the end, hopefully you'll get a higher return. Now, my first thinking, in all of this, and I'm sure some of you would agree with me, because gosh, this sounds like it's too good to be true. And I want you to think about these questions that I'm posing to you. And I borrowed some pictures from a friend of mine that is really, really good at social media and marketing her mill's products, but it takes a tremendous amount of time, and she would tell you that. So number one, do you have a product that will be interesting or demanded by consumers? And what volume of product do you have? If you only have a few sheep, you aren't going to have the volume to meet increasing demand. how are you going to get the word out? How are you going to be selling that product? Are you going to do a website? Are you going to do a blog or a vlog, a podcast, a newsletter? Are you good at social media? These things do matter. I mean, and taking good pictures. You need to be able to accurate. I mean, these are two perfect examples. These are very appealing displays of these products. And so good pictures make all the difference. Are you prepared to participate in some of these large venue festivals? Are you prepared to go every Saturday to a farmer's market? Sometimes that's a challenging thing to do. Are you prepared to have your farm open to visitors that may want to come and see where Sally lives, and on shearing day may want to be there when Sally is shorn? Are you prepared to do that? What payment method are you going to use? I use PayPal for a lot of things, but there's some downside to PayPal, and you have to have that in consideration. As what are your customers comfortable with using? What are the shipping costs from your area? I know that seems like a minor detail, but these are all questions that I think that you need to be prepared to answer before you dive into this avenue. I wanted to kind of also visit with you quickly about, there's all kinds of websites where you can market, from raw wool to products. I listed some of them here. The one that I follow closely is this one on Facebook called Raw Wool for Sale. You know, lots of people are familiar with the dirty fleece done dirt cheap. There's a number of them in Canada as well that you can use to market fleeces very effectively. I wanted to spend just a few quick minutes, and I know I didn't have this on my agenda, and I may have missed a lot of you already when talking about shearing day, but I think it's an important reminder, and I'd be amiss if I didn't kind of talk about this quickly. And the big topic of conversation in every sheep forum or sheep farmer's website is always about taking sheep off of feed and water prior to shearing. And according to the sheep care guide that ASI publishes, is that sheep can be held off of feed, or should be held off of feed and water, for a period of at least 6 hours and preferably 12 hours prior to shearing. The closer an animal is to lambing, if you're shearing pre-lambing, the less amount of time that they should be off of feed. But it's still acceptable and will not be problematic for a ewe if she's held off of feed and water. And trust me when I tell you, your shearer will be happier and your sheep will be more comfortable during the process. I know this is a difficult conversation to have, and it gets people fired up. I won't be honest, but I can safely say that this is a common and acceptable management practice. Certainly you want to separate during the shearing process from your most valuable fleeces to your least valuable fleeces. Try and get, if you are in a primarily white flock, and you have a few colored or black-faced sheep, they should be the last group to be shorn. Again, you're trying to eliminate or minimize the contamination of those dark fibers. Talk to whoever you're going to market to and ask them what they would like done. I'm going to speak up for my shearing and wool handling friends here, because sheep shearing and wool handling is really, really hard work, and it's important to take care of those people. And there are a lot of places that if they're there working all day, some places they don't get a hot meal. And I tell you from experience that a good hot meal will do wonders for a person who has to work all day. It'll increase their performance and their morale to get through that day. And I think it's very important. For a shearer, a day's worth of shearing, remember, is like running a marathon. And so we really want to be conscious of that. I get asked this at every workshop and every program that I do. Is this all worth my time, or do I really should I really bother? And I can honestly say that if you can do all of these steps, it is absolutely worth the time. Okay, quickly we're going to move through some last parting comments here about some uses of wool. I'm generalizing here. Of course, there's always an exception to this rule, but this is traditionally where apparel, outerwear, things like that are micron-wise where we usually fall. Some trends I wanted to just speak to you a little bit about is even China is looking for finer micron range, and they're trying to get into the sock and the knitwear game. Our domestic users want finer microns, but honestly, there are some parts that just aren't suited for producing those type of sheep, and they shouldn't. The superwash system and the sock industry is a game changer for the wool business. And I'm not going to speak tonight about the superwash system, but I can tell you from experience that our sock displays in sporting goods stores went from 10 years ago the size of your computer screen, basically now to aisles of different socks. And people are interested in American-made, American wool brands. And I'm listing some here. Farm to Feet, Wigwam, Crescent Socks have some brands that are American wool. Duckworth, of course. And then there's a new company coming online that'll be selling socks soon called the Fishhook Sock Company. Popularity of wool apparel is increasing greatly. These are a number of companies that produce wool apparel. I kind of listed the big three that are American wool, American made, in using their logos. One of the things that's really super cool, and I don't know about you, but I got 3 pairs of wool shoes, and they're new and they're cool, and people are excited about them, and encourage you to try them. As we're kind of getting closer to the end here, I get this question a lot, and I want to spend, and I know, Jay, you're prompting me to hurry and be done, but I think this is worth some time. And it's so frustrating for growers is, why is my coarser wools worth so little, while some of the fine wools have reached these unprecedented record prices? We've seen our coarser wools kind of been left behind, low prices over the last 3 years, and there's several reasons why. There's an overabundance of these type of wools in storage that are yet to process. The expansion for these wools have not been emphasized like they have been in some of the fine wools on a commercial scale. And I will venture to say that sometimes, and I will not generalize and say all the time, but sometimes there are quality issues from smaller flocks that might have higher black fiber content, they might have higher VM content, and that forces them to be in a category that doesn't create much value. And so we need to get ingenious here and create some uses for these type of wools. Here are some examples of what other countries are doing. Wool Cool uses about 10% of the wool clip. It's packaging for those, specialty food delivery systems. We've talked about wool pellets. You've seen information about that for gardening. I mentioned the dryer balls, surfboards made out of wool, insulation, roadside reclamation. So the last thing I want to talk to you a little bit about is, how do we create more value? And this is just going to take a minute, Jay, is again, capitalizing on this local food, local wool movement. And fiber sheds are leading the way in this regard. My Local Wool is a Facebook page that is new and exciting. Local Fiber, New York. Here's an example of a group of people, and my good friend Dana is involved in this intimately, and this is a workshop that they're going to do. And what she's finding is connecting all of these people is creating a great environment for wool. Wool advocates are another group that are involved in the Shave 'em and Save 'em from the Livestock Conservancy. We just need to become wool innovators again. And with that, I kind of want to get back to my original slide is, how are you spreading your love of wool? How are you communicating and pitching wool to new and different people all the time? And I feel very, obviously you can tell I got pretty wound up here, but I'm pretty excited about continuing wool advocacy and just getting more and more people involved. And so again, ponder that. If you're interested, here's how to reach me. Thanks, Jay. Thanks, Let's Grow. Here's me in a nutshell. Here's how to find me on Instagram and on Facebook, how to contact me, and I'd be happy to visit with you all on a more detailed basis. If Jay wants to fire some questions, again, I apologize for going maybe a little bit long, but gosh, I get windy when I get to talking about wool.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. Yeah, a lot of information to process there. And I want to launch your poll question because you wanted to get that from folks. And so I'm going to launch that so people can respond to that as we get started on the Q&A session. So you should be seeing that on your screens now, I think. So go ahead and respond as you see that. Once again, several people sent in questions while you were speaking. I want to go through those and encourage other people that have questions to either type them in the question box, or if you have a microphone and would like to just ask Lisa directly, you can raise your hand. There should be a little hand icon on that tab on the upper left side of your dashboard that you can click on and let me know that you have a question. Just be prepared for me to call on you by name and unmute your microphone if you do that. So you had at your ending slide there the OFDA machine. That's a machine. Is that correct with the testing thing?
That's correct. Yes,
okay, so people were asking what that stands for. Is that
optical fiber diameter analyzer? Okay,
thank you. So I didn't know what it stood for. I just knew it was a machine. So thank you for answering that question. And when you were talking about the actual fiber count, micron count, and all that stuff early on, what's the best way for a small producer to get that tested? Is it to send a sample in someplace? What do you recommend for those that haven't done that before?
Well, I would say if you have the opportunity to send a sample to a lab, I would encourage you to do that. And there's a couple of reasons. Not only it gives you a plethora of information, but it also helps build support for those university labs. And I'll speak to that just briefly because I was a part of the lab at Montana State. And universities are under constant pressure to produce a product or have a business plan, so to speak. And I can say that the volume of samples that labs test is important to, the bottom line of that lab. And so twofold, it's important to support your university labs. It's important to support your commercial wool testing lab, but it also gives you a whole bunch of information that helps you in sheep selection. It helps you in fleece marketing. It helps you, again, just provide your consumers with more information and more knowledge. And those things are powerful.
Okay, very good. It looks like most people, like the voting has tailed off here. So I'm going to go ahead and close the polling and show you the results. Let's see, do I have to share? There we go. So, okay. Can you see that?
It says something on my screen, sharing poll results. Organizer must hide poll results to enable screen sharing.
Okay. Is that up now?
Oh, I may have to. Do I have to do a drop down? We can figure this out. Is there more questions from the?
Yeah, we could.
The,
why don't we do that, and then I'll share my screen. I know that I can do that. So let me ask you another question. So people were asking about the ranch blankets. Where are people having those made? Is there somewhere in the U.S. that does this?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and I'm not sure how many places have the capability of going all the way from scouring of the wool all the way to weaving a blanket. And so there may be several companies that or businesses that you have to work with. And I think about Bartlett is an example. Mountain Meadow Woolen Mill is an example of places that have the capability of going at least almost all of the way. And then you may have to seek another company to actually do the blankets. Unfortunately, Faribault used to do some custom. Faribault in Minnesota used to do some custom products, custom blankets, and in fact, I had some custom blankets done for Montana, or a custom product done for Montana State. Unfortunately, they're not doing custom products anymore, so. It is challenging to find and build a relationship with somebody, and so I can find that out for you if you're keen for it, but I don't have that at my fingertips right now. Okay.
Okay, so I'm not sure if people can see the poll results. I'm getting some odd messages
here. It popped up
here
on my screen for a second, but I don't see it now.
Okay, yeah, it's 58% specialty markets and 44% value-added products and 42% commercial channels. So majority of people were in the specialty markets. Yes,
that's interesting. I'm glad that we reached those people, but I'm also glad that we had some commercial marketing folks on the presentation as well. I think again the purpose of that poll was to demonstrate the interest, or the I guess trying to get at that number, because I've had a lot of people ask me, well, what value do these folks contribute to the wool market? And, that number is hard to put your hands around. And so the more information that we can gather, the better.
Okay, you were talking about crimp and curvature. Somebody asked if you could expand on the relationship between crimp and curvature. We've talked extensively about the high level of crimp in heli wool. This is somebody from Montana. But we do not talk about curvature. So can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so curvature is kind of I wouldn't necessarily say it's a new trait, but it is kind of a newer trait that we track in, for instance, some of our purebred operations that follow or use NSIP, National Sheep Improvement Program, that are focused in on genetic records and EBVs. And so curvature is a factor, a wool factor that we're tracking. Again, curvature relates to the crimps per inch in wool. And so what that relationship is harder to, a little bit harder to understand. We know that wools that have high curvature have more spring, more loft, more resistance to compression. And those three factors are really, really important if we're making knitwear and we're making socks. Whereas wools with the same micron and lower curvature produce a less springy yarn, a flatter, more predictable spinning yarn that may be better suited for worsted suiting, for instance, making fine Italian suits. That yarn doesn't have that spring, that bounce, that loft and makes a very flat, predictable fabric. And so again, it depends on the direction that your wool is going. A lot of our wool, for instance, the Duckworth or the Helly Rambouillet products are knitwear. And so you want that spring, you want that loft, you want that resistance to compression.
Okay, and I switched back to you as the presenter. If you wouldn't mind putting your slides back up. We've had a request to look at the slide for uses for coarser wool again. So if you wouldn't mind sharing your screen and putting that up for people to look at while we answer some more questions here.
Oh, remind me again.
You should.
Let's see, shows.
There you go. Now? Yep, we see it now. So just backtrack to that coarser uses for coarser wool slide there that you had towards the end.
It takes me a minute to go through all this animation. My apologies.
Yeah, you can bounce out of your presentation probably and just go back and find it if you like. I don't think people will mind that.
Was it this one?
We're seeing your other screen right now. There we go. That's it.
Okay.
Right around there.
Again, when I put this up, it was just meant to be a really generalization. Of course, we can make other products out of coarser wools or finer wools. Again, this was kind of just meant to be a generalization.
Okay, and we had a couple of comments come in on the contamination stuff. One on the paint. Somebody mentioned ram marker paint and whether that's an issue. And then somebody else mentioned sand in the wool. Are those common issues and things for people to be concerned about?
Well, certainly. I mean, the ram marker stuff. And I haven't honestly used too much of that, but if I remember correctly, the normal ram marker harness type product is, and where it just minimally marks the back of an animal, that product is meant to be scourable. Where I get a little bit worried about is that the kind that you completely saturate the chest of a ram. And I'm losing the term for that. Like I want to say it's like rattle powder or something like that, where you manipulate that material to stick to the chest of a ram, and it's used in the same way. It's just maybe not as restrictive as movement wise as a harness might be perceived. And I worry a little bit about that just for the ram fleece. And I would have a tendency, of course, to skirt all of that out, just to be on the safe side. Yeah. And in terms of...
No, go ahead.
Go ahead, Jay. That's fine.
No, you mentioned skirting, and somebody asked for a little more of an explanation of that versus the classing and sorting you went through with some pictures. But what is skirting exactly?
Yeah. So skirting would typically obviously occur at shearing time. If you have an opportunity to remove some of those inferior bits of wool, sweat locks, short wool from around the frib or the edge of the fleece, any back end staining, for instance, or urine or fecal staining. You're skirting that type. When you get into more of the specialty market avenue, you may do a much more detailed job and spend much more time picking and skirting or removing those inferior bits, and you may even separate fleeces into parts that are very uniform in style to market. Excuse me. And so basically the activity of skirting is to remove the inferior bits of wool that aren't uniform in style of that fleece, for that fleece.
Okay. Somebody asked a question on a national basis. Are there discussions about the development of another scouring facility?
You know, that's a good question. I mean, there is, you know, what I would consider medium-sized scouring facilities. You know, of course, in Texas, there's Bowman, you know, and there's some medium-sized mills that can handle, you know, and I mentioned Bartlett. I know they can handle a little bit larger. The challenge in that, and I've been told many times, for instance, with chargiers, is that the water that comes out of the facility is even cleaner than the water that goes in. And so the idea that restricting the building or the investment in another facility, you know, because of environmental regulations is hard for me to understand. The biggest challenge is do we have the volume commercially to justify a national, you know, for instance, a national investment in that type of facility? As we know, and if you watch the statistics of sheep numbers across the U.S., of course, some states are growing, but some states are not. And so, how do we weigh? You know, it's kind of like the chicken and the egg thought process. Do we have the volume of wool to process now? Do we build sheep numbers and then, you know, and then hope? Do you see where I'm going with this?
Yeah.
And so I certainly think that there's a need to be able to scour smaller lots of wool effectively and efficiently, cost-wise. And I'm not sure, you know, where we're going to be at in the future with that.
Okay, and I know we're running long, and I appreciate all the people that have stayed on with questions, so I do want to ask those to you so they get a chance to get those answered. But some people have asked about transcripts or recordings. This is being recorded. You will get a follow-up email with a link to the recording and a link to Lisa's slides, so look for that in your inbox sometime in the next 48 hours. I usually try to get out the next day. So those of you that have been asking that's the answer to that question. Somebody asked about using thin plastic wool blankets that can be purchased to keep the wool cleaner. Do you think it is worth using these?
You mean just for jacketing or coating?
That's what I'm assuming. There's not more details on it. Yeah.
You know, again, I mean, it's not just as simple as putting a coat or a jacket on a sheep. You have to change those. You know, as a fleece grows, you have to change those a number of times, and so you have to have increasing size of those jackets. Otherwise, you get compression of the fleece, and you'll get you know, matting or cotting of that wool. And the idea, yes, of course, is to keep it clean, but the idea is also not to restrict the growth of that wool fiber and compress it or restrict its growth in any way. And so, again, if you're going this specialty market, and I can tell you that, you know, the words coated do, you know, get people excited, particularly on some of those high value breeds. You know, and the example I talked about during my presentation, that fleece was a Cormo fleece. Cormo is like, you know, it's a hot topic. And so if you've got some of these specialty breeds that are very sought after, that investment that I think can pay you dividends.
Okay. Quick question on the turnaround time for OFDA testing. What should a producer expect there if they send something in?
Well, I think that the university labs are PDQ. I mean, they try and get them turned around. I know at the wool lab in Montana, I think they've got devoted, students and staff there to do it. I know same with certainly at Texas A&M as well. And so I would expect the turnaround would be, no more than a week to 10 days. I think that's fair to say.
And a question from somebody that's helping manage a state wool pool. They were disappointed in the low reimbursement rate they got last year and attribute at least a significant amount of it to low quality clip. They were wondering how they can encourage and educate their members to improve the quality of their clip. Any advice?
Yeah, and that's I would agree with this person that's such a difficult message to get across, and trying to encourage those producers to have a sense of, and I think of it like this, having a sense of pride in the product that they're producing. They may not have the ability to skirt, they may not have the ability to or want to do those additional steps, but if they can do something as simple as trying to change, if they've got a lot of chaff or something in their feeding system that is causing a bunch of contamination, think about how you can change your production system to reduce those things. I would encourage the pool chairman or president to provide some type of educational program, and I know that's a big ask, but also in the materials that they send out to the pool participants. Here's a pamphlet, here's a one-pager, here's something that talks about, here are small steps that we can take to make our pool, to elevate our pool, to a higher level.
Okay, I got one follow-up question to that, but before I do that, I want to give a shout out to University of Maine Extension. Hopefully everybody saw the publication I shared. Thank you, Richard, for that. It's on how to get ready for the shear. So thank you for sharing that with me, Richard, that I could get that out to people. And my
Great product.
Yeah, and my follow-up question is related to this improving wool quality. Somebody asked, well, there's two parts to it from two different people. One said, which gives us the best bang for our buck, improving micron, staple length, or comfort factor? Another person asked a general question in terms of whether the fiber diameter increases or decreases with the age of the sheep, or is there anything there to consider?
I'll tackle the last question first. I would say as a sheep goes from its first shearing to being a mature animal, so from a lamb to a mature animal, there would be a change there, but the change from that point going forward should be minimal. And so in big production settings, people who are selecting replacement animals, and they're doing so based on micron testing, they make the assumption that you will not change beyond her second fleece, that she shouldn't change. She might change a little bit based on feeding regime, so to speak, whether maybe it was a tough year drought-wise, or maybe it was an exceptional year with lots of green grass, all the way through summer and into the fall. That may change, but that would change the whole clip as opposed to just changing an individual. And so, that's how I'd answer that question.
So the other one was the best bang for the buck, micron, staple length, comfort factor.
Well, again, you get, with an off the test, you get all of those things. You don't just have to choose one or the other. As I mentioned, if you choose to do fiber testing utilizing one of the university labs.
Yeah, I think they're asking the question in terms of trying to improve their wool quality. So as far as managing their flock, if they're trying to move it in a direction, is there anything?
And I'll use this as an example. I have a client that, and I actually had thought about putting it in this presentation. I had a little video of him talking about what he had done, and he had a clip of wool that was above 24 micron about 5 or 6 years ago. And his goal was to move his sheet to about 22 micron. And he was able to accomplish that very effectively, focusing in on fiber diameter, but also picking rams that didn't lack in terms of fleece weight or staple length, but met his criteria for fiber diameter. And so he was able to gradually move his whole flock through selection to a target where he wanted to be. And he felt like 22 micron was the sweet spot for his production setting. And so, you know, I would say, again, primarily we focus in on micron, fiber diameter. These other parameters may be of interest to, again, some of our specialty market avenues, but always, for the most part, micron is going to be a primary indicator of value.
Okay, thank you. And thank you to all the folks who asked great questions and stuck around. And thank you, Lisa, for you know, your presentation and patience in working through the questions. Once again, this will be a recording link will go out to all registrations within the next 48 hours, and you can watch it there and also take a look at some of these slides if you have more of an interest in it. I want to end by just, again, thanking the Let's Grow Committee for providing the funding for these and the American sheep industry backing that, and for making these all available. We will have our next webinar will actually be on June the 4th, and we're going to tackle some foot health issues and foot rot with Mike Neary of Purdue University. And so you'll be getting some emails inviting you to register for that if you're interested here in the next couple of weeks. So thanks again, Lisa, for a great presentation, and thank you again to the audience for joining us.
This was fun, so I hope everybody got something out of it and got some value in it. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.